Dune's got a lot going on for only telling half of the story of the first book, so whether you know the way of the Golden Path or just found out about Dune, let's take a look at some of the things you may have missed or didn't notice in Villeneuve's Dune, and there's gonna be spoilers for a lot, so brace yourself. So from the movie, you can tell that the Fremen of Arrakis have a strong love for the giant sandworms named Shai-Hulud, or the Maker, depending on who you ask. I mean, they are important for the spice, so that makes sense, but the presence of worm symbolism extends way past just that in this universe. One of the giant spaceships we see, a Highliner, looks very wormy, as well as even the Baron at one point while he's floating, which I'll get to, also seems to be a nod to Dune's potential future, but let's not get ahead of ourselves too much. I mean, I'm gonna talk about God Emperor because it's a cool name, but we can't just front load everything right now. Okay, but let's actually go back to the Baron floating because the way he floats is another one of Dune's subtle tech inclusions. So when we first see it being used, it's kinda obvious that the Baron might have a little too much meat on his bones and that's how he gets around, but he's not the only one who uses the Suspenders, which the name didn't make me think of Urkel, but here we are. The other people that we see using the Suspenders are the Sardaukar during both the invasion of Arrakis, the place on Arrakis, and when they assault the Fremen ecological hideout. We only see them used in 2 books, and one Dune fans tend to not want to talk about, so it's cool that we got to see them used in a combat scenario in this movie. Last thing about the worms, I promise, but one of the things that the movie makes very clear is that the Shai-Hulud look for rhythmic patterns, and it's not just because they love a good beat either. When one of them is about to munch on Paul and Jessica, it looks like it's trying to communicate in some way, but that thumping bass sound coming from its insides seems to be why they're so drawn to rhythmic patterns. It's a way for them to defend their territory. And in the books, they mainly only eat sand, so it's not like they're looking for food that way either. Honestly, let's just forget all that political intrigue. I can't wait to see more of that wormy action in part 2. While the Atreides clan is still on Caladan, there's a lot of bull references, which we learn is because Paul's grandpa liked to bullfight, for reasons, but because he eventually lost, they hang the bull up as a memory, along with some other bull paraphernalia all around. But all that bull talk was actually foreshadowing what was going to happen on Arrakis. To see why, we gotta get into some etymology. So the word Harkonnen is derived from the Finnish word harka, and guess what harka means? Ox, which is technically different than a bull, but close enough because at least for part 1, the Harkonnen proved to be the downfall of the Atreides as the bull was to Grand Paul. Now, if only there was another cycle of violence that is perpetrated throughout history that the novels expanded upon. Now, let's talk about some of the other versions of Dune, specifically Jodorowsky's weird unmade version. In terms of cult movies that were never made, Jodorowsky's vision has to be at least top 3 of all time. Even with it having very little to do with Dune actually, Villeneuve still pays homage to it in a couple of ways. The first one comes when we first see Getty Prime. Because of its dark and somewhat biological mechanical feel to it, it feels like a city made out of whatever the xenomorphs are made out of, which makes sense because that's what H.R. Giger made, and he was also attached to Jodorowsky's Dune. The second instance comes from the trailer, so it's less important to this video, but the song that plays is a cover of a Pink Floyd song, and Jodorowsky wanted to have Pink Floyd to do the soundtrack. Jodorowsky is a weird guy, and his version of Dune would have also been super weird, but even with it not being released, it's cool that some parts at least have been carried forward into this version. Before Villeneuve's and after Jodorowsky's failed attempt, there was David Lynch's version, which, unlike this one, is a full story, but also unlike this one, is very silly. He still gets at least one shout out in this version though too. So after the Duke bites the dust, ha ha ha, please laugh. When the Harkonnen are cleaning up, they're wearing hazmat suits since the area must still be toxic, but those suits look suspiciously like the Sardaukar from Lynch's version. Time hasn't been very kind to Lynch's version, and while I will always defend my favorite weatherman, I will say that it's nice that he also got a little nod in this too. A big part of the movie is trying to decipher Paul's visions. Some of them are proven to be wrong or not literal, like with Jameis not being the nice teacher of the ways of the sand like in his visions, but his visions aren't seeing the future, they're seeing potential futures, and the movie doesn't really explain that. But even with that, the idea or the main points of those visions seem to be where the movie wants to move the narrative. So for example, back with Jameis again. Sure, he doesn't take Paul under his wing to teach him, but in their fight, he does end up teaching him about violence and the ways of the Fremen. It's just not in the way he would have liked. Hopefully though, we do end up getting to see that massive Power Ranger fight on Caladan in all its glory. Okay, while the fight between Jamis and Paul is largely the same with a few differences like the location and what they're wearing, it's close enough that it doesn't matter. So it was kind of weird when before the fight, Chani doesn't give Paul the same advice that she does in the book. In the book, she warns him about Jamis being able to use both hands in the fight and that he should watch for the knife to switch. While that doesn't happen, Jamis still switches hands, so at least those with knowledge of the book would have that little Easter egg to find. It's not hugely important to the story, but hey, if you couldn't tell by now, this movie loves putting little moments and symbols in that have no bearing on really anything. Since we didn't get a lot of time with the Fremen as a whole, a lot of their culture isn't known to us. We know that because they live in the desert, they value that sweet 70% of us, but aside from that, we don't know anything really concrete. One thing that you might have missed is that right before the Jamis-Paul fight, when the Fremen sheathe their blades, they cut their hands first because they believe that if you draw your weapon, it has to draw blood. Now, it is a little weird when Mapes, a Fremen, draws her blade to show Jessica and doesn't draw blood when she sheathes it, but maybe that's because she was giving the blade to her and didn't want to dirty it up. This is where some continuity problems start popping up, but most people didn't even notice, so who cares, it's fine. Usually when bad guys say something, they're lying, but the Baron is different. He'll say something so specific and agree with a person's demands, but only if his words are vague enough so that he can always default on, I did exactly what I said. Kinda like a big child, or a genie. In the movie, this happens twice. The first is when he tells Gaius Helen Mohayim that he will not lay a finger on Jessica and Paul, only to try and let the desert kill them instead. The second comes when he tells Dr. Yue that he'll be able to join his wife soon, but only because they're gonna be floating in that big sandbox in the sky. You're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, even though that's exactly what a book cover is designed for, but when a dude that looks like the Baron tells you anything that sounds too good to be true, it's for sure too good to be true. Let's keep going with things that the movie shows but doesn't talk about at all. The Spacing Guild, or the Guild of Navigators, is a group that holds faster than light travel exclusively so that you have to go through them to use it. Navigators are these creatures that have been mutated from constant spice use, and they guide ships through prescience so that when a ship essentially teleports across the universe, they don't bump into a planet and explode. While we don't see any navigators directly, when the Herald of the Change comes to Caladan, he's joined by members and representatives of the Spacing Guild. Considering how powerful the guild is with their hold on FTL travel, them showing up to this shows just how important this change and how important Arrakis is to the Empire and really the universe. Here's another thing that they show but don't expand on at all. So when the Atreides first land on Arrakis, we see Gurney Halleck reading something before the ship lands. What he was reading is called the Orange Catholic Bible, which was first called the Karangiana Zen Christian Scriptures, but then because Karangiana kinda sounds like orange, and Zen Christian was changed to Catholic, which can also mean all-encompassing since the book is an amalgamation of all the religions on Earth, OCB became the new name. Now in the books, there's only two main devotees that matter in the story, Dr. Yue and Gurney, with Gurney often reciting various verses. Considering that Gurney doesn't really get a lot of screen time in this, little details like this do help flesh out his character. I mean, only if you knew that beforehand. But that's why you have videos like these. Since we were just talking about him, let's talk about what happened to Gurney Halleck, since we see him fight during the invasion, but we don't see what happens to him. Well, because this likely will be talked about in the next movie, and spoiling a movie that technically hasn't even been announced yet, as I was editing this, they just confirmed part 2, so there you go. I'll just say that he shouldn't be dead, and that we should be seeing him soon. Yep, that's totally vague enough. Well, what happened to the nice old guy that we also got zero backstory on? Well, his name is Thurfir Hawat. He's a Mentat, which just means he's a guy who can do what a computer can do. And since this is similar to what happened to Gurney, I'll also just say that he should totally still be alive and will probably also be included in the next movie. They did already change his plotline from thinking that Jessica could be a mole though, so anything could change, but I'd prefer not to say more than I actually need to for things like this. Another character that has long-reaching importance is Duncan Idaho. I mean, with a name like that, he's gotta be important. So we talked about Paul's visions and how they're more about potential futures, but his vision on Idaho is pretty spot on, and we get a clue to it before it even happens. So when we see Paul's first vision at the end, we see a little beetle, and right before Idaho starts his last stand, we see him playing with one. And because Dune just loves animal metaphors, beetles, specifically of the dung and scarab varieties, are references to the Egyptian god Khepri, who can represent renewal and creation, which, well, let's just go to the next entry so I can talk about it a little bit more. So, we just talked about his death, but are we sure that he's actually dead? But we saw him die, you just talked about it, you exclaim at your screen. Well, that's true, and because this is a spoiler for Dune Messiah, the second book and most likely third movie, I feel like I'm in the clear, and if not, I'm about to spoil Dune Messiah and most likely the third movie. Duncan Idaho comes back as a character named Hate as a Gola, which just means that they're a clone. The reason I'm bringing all of this up is because after we already see Duncan's last stand, we see a Fremen who looks oddly close to the space surfer dude that we came to love. It's not clear what this scene even is either. It looks like an inverse shot of one of Paul's visions, but it doesn't have the same orangey glow, and in the books, Hate isn't made by the Fremen, so this inclusion is just very strange. If you've got any ideas on what this scene really was, definitely drop them down in the comments. Now, let's talk about the spaceships and how spice works with them. So the movie puts a lot of emphasis on spice being used as the way that these ships travel, but they don't talk about how at all. It's not used in the same way that oil or even other forms of energy work. Rather, it actually allows those navigators that I mentioned earlier to fold space and time. Now, if you can just wormhole your way around the cosmos, then it makes sense that if you look at the few spaceships that we do see, there's no thrusters or even any of that basic spaceship propulsion systems that you usually see. Again, little details like that almost no one will care about just makes this world feel so much more cohesive. Speaking of the world, at the beginning of the movie, we get a year that the movie takes place. The year 10,191. However, this movie doesn't take place just 8,000 years from our own time now. Instead of going off of our present calendar system, it's actually going off the year that the Spacing Guild was created. So anything before that is BG and anything after that is AG. On the Dune fandom, which so graciously did all the math so I wouldn't have to, they concluded that the year would actually be 23,352 AD, which gives us an extra 10,000 years of human development to account for. When things are set thousands of years in the future, it can get a little difficult to rationalize it, but just remember that only 1,000 years ago were the Middle Ages, and pretty much any tech that we have now would be considered witchcraft back then. So just imagine all the wild stuff that we haven't seen yet in this universe. In Dune's case though, they could also just be a different time frame entirely because not everything has to be based on our very specific universe. But if I can give you guys a random fact that could give context, I'm gonna do it. Even without the context of everything else, Dune makes it very clear that Paul is supposed to be a pretty big deal in the grand scheme of galactic and universal politics. His first taste of that comes during his time with the Fremen, but his title among them is teased multiple times during the movie, and it's all because of this little guy. Throughout the movie, twice by my count, we see these guys and Paul seems to have a connection to them, if only because they look so cute. Now, the reason why they matter is because the little sand mice are called Muad'Dib, which is a name that Paul gets during his time with the Fremen. Sure, Desert Mouse isn't the most intimidating name, but it's cool that we got a tease to this important step in Paul's future. Also, WB and Legendary, you could definitely make some Muad'Dib plushies. I mean, people bought the screaming penguin things from Star Wars, so I'm pretty sure they'll buy anything. Finally, let's end where the movie begins. Now, to me, when the unintelligible, bone-shattering speech hit my eardrums, my first thought was, I don't think I'm gonna like this movie. But the message itself comes with importance to the story. Of course, it's a reference to the dreams and visions of Paul in this movie, but dreams and prescience in general have a really big role in the Dune universe. But the issue is, we don't know who's saying this or why. We know that it isn't someone using the voice, because you can still understand that, and while it does sound similar to the Sardaukar, it doesn't really make sense for them to say it since they're not really involved with these visions. I've already seen theories to it being the characters from Dune's past all the way up to the God Emperor himself, and while it's not like we would find that out for several years if they do plan on continuing this franchise that long, these movies being a sort of recollection while on his proverbial deathbed, or him reliving things through his other memories, could make this one of my favorite franchise hints. And if that paragraph didn't make any sense, don't worry, a trip to your local wiki fandom can help out a whole lot. I'll be honest, after watching Dune for the first time, I didn't like it. But after all the research I had to do for this, I'm pretty sure I'm a fan of the franchise now. I still think it's dumb to not have a functional end to a movie, but hey, they didn't give me $165 million to make a movie, so what do I know? Oh, and something outro about things you missed.